Perfect. Yeah. So as I was saying, I'm Brett Halverson and I work at VSJF as a program coordinator. And Victoria is with us as our session host for the technical details. And I can reintroduce our panelist, Megan Brakely, who's from the Relief Collective. Thanks for coming, Megan. And just before we get started, I just wanted to quickly run through some of our group agreements for the session. So just hoping everyone comes to the conversation from a place of respect and kindness. And if everyone can just make sure your Zoom name reflects your first and last name and your place of work or your affiliation, if that's applicable. And if everyone could remain muted unless you're called upon or engaging in a conversation, and you can use the raise hand feature to let you know when you'd like to speak. And you can also type in questions or comments to the chat. And then we'll just try to avoid interrupting each other. And I just want to make note that the session is being recorded and will be shared on our website after the gathering. So with that, I'll just kind of turn it over to everyone for some reflections on the morning. If people wanted to start by putting some reflections or questions for Megan into the chat, we could start that way and see what comes up and then go from there and kind of just jump into an informal conversation, if that sounds okay to everyone.
Can I make a confession really quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have this watch that is like 15 years old that I've worn every day in that time, and I started the timer on my watch, and then it's like been completely on the fritz. So I have no idea. Did that take less than 15 minutes?
The presentation.
My presentation.
Yeah, I think so.
Did
Yeah,
it
I
go?
think it was
Okay,
perfect.
I think I tried to talk really fast because I lost track of time, so I apologize if it was just like
No worries. No, I think it worked out
like
perfect.
I had a system and it failed me. So apologies for that. Just
No
name that.
worries. I feel like it's easy to lose track of time in a virtual presentation. So looks like some questions are coming in the chat. Could also be reflections on this morning's presentation.
I see a question from Lindsay. It says that interested by the net analogy and the work of repairing the connections or knots when necessary, and speak to what that looks like in my experience. So when I think about interactions, I think about them as being discrete, like we're in the moment and there's context, and that's really important, and people are bringing experiences to an interaction. And sometimes it's really helpful to have all of that kind of in the room with you, and sometimes it's helpful just to connect on a human level. And so when I think about my own experience in repairing the connections or knots, I think actually a lot about Adrienne Maree Brown's work around and the work of Mia Mingus, who's a Korean adoptee who writes a lot about repair and harm, and just proper ways, and I don't use proper very often, but appropriate ways of thinking about making an apology, a real apology. And she just pretty much lays out the steps, which is so beautiful. She has a blog, Mia Mingus has a blog. And I think about Adrienne Maree Brown's writing about productive conflict and really finding tension and seeing that as generative, to open up and offer ways that are safe, but also open up more vulnerability and real sharing and learning. I think about repairing the connections and knots. I think about, from a really personal perspective, it's just so fascinating to me. I am a Korean adoptee. I was raised by a white family in very rural, middle class America. And so when people make assumptions, cultural assumptions about my upbringing, they probably don't assume that my favorite food as a child was like Hungry Jack instant mashed potatoes and meatloaf, which is what we ate most nights. And I think about the ways that the connections that I have wanted to make, but always been afraid to make, are ways that I've internalized white supremacy thinking about who is authentic enough or whose experience is valid enough to step into a certain space, like a BIPOC affinity space. And my own personal interactions with and feelings about how I identify within categorical denominations that are on a census survey are complex, and I don't usually talk about it. And it's taken me 37 years to be able to say, oh, I don't have to go there every time. I can just say, that's something that I don't often talk about, or that's a really personal question. So I think about repairing the connections and the knots. I think about our own work to let ourselves be gentle with ourselves. I think about repairing connections when there are like actually really important chasms to address and name that often aren't. So I think about discrepancies and anti-Blackness, especially within the Asian community. I look at the ways that Korean adoptees, as folks with really close proximity to whiteness, handle their privilege and power in relation to anti-Blackness with their white families. That's typically, those are some of the typical patterns that come up in Korean adoptee spaces. And I think about how that network, that the knot tying it requires context, but it also requires like laser focus sometimes of just connecting to each other one-to-one and in a human way. That was really a lot of information. I apologize. That was way more than you were looking for there. And I see other questions too. I can definitely put the author, Mia Mingus, on harm, repair, and apologies. And Adrienne Marie.
That's great. Thanks, Megan.
And I see a question, emergent strategies, sure, exactly. And I don't know if this is being recorded to read for the later recording. Lynn, do you want to just read your question? I appreciate it, seeing it written too. It's so helpful. Thanks.
Sure. Yeah, we're using the emergent strategy as our textbook in this class right now, Understanding Food Insecurity in Bennington, with Tatiana Abatimarco. So it's just really exciting to hear you talk about it. And there's so much in that book and in this class that we're touching on that relates right back to what you're talking about. So yeah, I'm just interested in this kind of idea you were talking about shared responsibility, as opposed to traditional kind of hierarchical structures. And I guess coming from the standpoint of like personally being a very A-type person, and kind of if you could go into more of like the logisticals of shared responsibility and how that works, and how people who are naturally more prone to being leaders don't, how can you share those responsibilities, and how can you step down and really create that equal plane?
Oh, this is a great question, and if you figure it out, let me know, okay? I feel like there are multiple parts of your question. Um, I think about shared responsibility and hierarchical systems in opposition, and I think about revisiting some of those ideas while also like stripping them back of some of our assumptions and thinking about um, new ways of interacting with ideas that we think we know. So shared responsibility doesn't mean that everyone carries the same weight or everyone offers um, the same input or types of participation. And I think about hierarchy. Hierarchy is just one it's one tool, one diagram that provides a structure. So instead, and we need structure, right? Like a net doesn't have any strength if the knot's tied randomly here and there. It might get you by for a little while, but when it's under pressure, it's not going to cut it. So thinking about creative types of structure, but also this is some of the work that we've really been in deep with relief in our early stages is there aren't as many great precedents as we might wish that were out there. And this kind of work is so critically important and so easily glossed over in our rush to like get things done and work on this response or this uh, policy brief, you know. So I think reframing the work to be willing to slow way down to look at the values that inform how the work gets done, looking at our at mission and what it is that we really think we're doing, whether that truly squares with our values, and then you know feeling it out, and then when it doesn't work, circling back and doing something about it, you know, being accountable to each other. It makes for very slow progress, but I think that if an organization really has a clear vision of our shared goal, then it's easier to wade through it without being so outcome oriented, or your outcome is really this big idea, and it's I think also Lynn, I think about my father-in-law who's a middle school teacher and he taught middle school for 40 years, and one of my favorite things, you know, he was a teacher for 40 years, and he says his job as a teacher is to draw out of each person what it is that they're proud of and what makes them special, and to be able to speak as an expert to that. And so I think about, you know, when we think about typical ideas of leadership, I have so many ideas that are based on the absence of what I've experienced in the world sometimes, right? And it's like, oh, what is leadership? What I can see plenty of examples of what I don't think it is quite. I can see plenty of examples of really good ideas and tricky on the execution. And I can also just to think really simply, like how can what is the first thing that I would wish? I would wish that we could be generous to ourselves in being patient and being committed to the deep work, knowing that it's real hard and we're not set up to be tremendously successful in that, and that's so we move. You know, these are not challenges that we created overnight. These are not challenges we're going to roll over tomorrow. So generosity, listening, and appreciating that everyone in the room has so much to contribute and offer, and our job as leaders is really to help. Robin Wall Kimmerer had a great quote about that. She said, "An educated person is someone who knows what their gifts are and how to use them in the world." And I think that building on that, I think about a leader is someone who can help others see that in themselves and then build a vessel that they can use and exercise those gifts and feel good about it. To, make some meaning there. I don't know if that answers your question.
That really does. Thank you.
Sure. I also really don't like this, like, I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm also really happy to just like hear about what's going on for you all. And it's weird to me to like be in a room without, we're not in the ballroom, to like get to know people. Ollie, it's great to see you. I think the last time we saw each other was at the hand mowing competition at Field Days, which is so rad. I love that.
I know, it feels like so long ago, but also kind of yesterday.
Ollie is a wicked good cider.
Nice. That's awesome.
Well, I also have a question, thoughts, not really a fully formed question. I'm curious to hear everybody's thoughts on it. I feel like a couple of the points you were talking about, sort of shifting material resources and power, and I think that a lot of white-led organizations who want to like do the work have sort of turned internally and said we need to look at ourselves first and think about stuff very deeply and are trying to be intentional and not go too fast. And at the same time, like, I see that manifesting in a sort of surface level change in language around equity without commitment to moving resources and power. And so it's probably a both and, because most things are, but like, I wonder if from all of your perspectives, like, are we on track? Is that worrying that organizations are just turning in on themselves? Not people turning on each other, but like being sort of self-focused and spending a lot of time talking in circles. And are we making progress in the internal learning that we think we're trying to do? And is that setting us up to make shifts in power and resources, or are we using those sort of processes of like, let's get a group together and talk about what we're talking about and maybe hire a consultant and make a plan and all those things? Like, is that a way of not taking responsibility for shifting power? I think it's a both and. Like, I just like, it's what the work that is being done, I think, is important, and the like white supremacy culture element of urgency is, I feel like, a really hard one for me to grapple with, because problems of inequity are extremely urgent, and at the same time, if we act with urgency, we can kind of trip over ourselves and make things way worse. So like, yeah, not a question that I want an answer to. I just want, if folks are thinking about that in their own work and organizations there, or networks, or whatever communities you're involved in, I'd really love to hear what you think.
I know, coming from being a college student at a very liberal arts college, some of the efforts that we're doing here. So there's a wonderful group called the We Project that was started by two students, kind of in the wake of all of us going into quarantine, and a lot of the urgency of this necessity to really turn towards anti-racist thought being brought up in all of the wake of the incidences and things that were happening during the summer of 2020. So this group was started, and I think the way that it's really functioned and worked really well is that it's not just about being within this community of Bennington College. So it's also about kind of taking in friends and family members into these spaces. And basically what they do is they just have kind of online forums and affinity spaces, but they also have, they did a workshop on that book, Me and White Supremacy. And they've just had really wonderful workshops as well, where There was one that I took part in that was just talking about identity and just opening up this question of like, what is identity? What do we see ourselves as? Who are we? And having to break down the specifics of those questions, and kind of contextualize them within this community, but then also think of this as not being just a small bubble that, we're here for 4 years, and then just how that translates to the world outside of this. And so I would say, just from that kind of perspective of really finding the importance of like having the connection to reality outside of whatever bubble it is. And I can't speak to, a working kind of like a career or organization that's not educational in that sense. But that's, I think, just a good example that I can think of how those systems are kind of working.
Thanks for sharing.
I can mention, as like a white person who works at a white-led organization, like from my perspective, like these questions that you brought up, I think, like I mean, young is a relative word, but I've only been like working in the setting that I work in now for a few years, and like that conversation comes up, like I feel like every day. And I think where this is like totally just like my best guess, right? If we're all like making our best guess, but that the both and thing really is the answer. And like trying to grapple with, like you were saying, Megan, earlier, like how do you like gracefully accept boundaries, and how do you like remain nimble and flexible, so that if people are like generous to provide feedback, you're like ready to do something with it, so that you can do your best at the same time that you work to do better. And I feel like for me personally, it can feel really scary to be like, what, I'm like doing my best while I know that I could be doing better. Like that's a pile of trash. Like I shouldn't be doing this then if I know that I could be doing better. But it is like that both and, because there is a sense of like real people's lives are happening right now. So you have to do your best now. And that, real change is going to take all of our lifetimes and more. And so you have to be prepared to do better as well. And yeah, I really am glad that you brought that up, because I think that's like a really important question to constantly be asking. And I know it comes up all the time in all the spaces I'm in.
I think it's really difficult to I mean, Ollie, I think at the heart too of some elements of your question are just power and privilege, and what is our responsibility to each other, right? And we are led naturally, we're society led to thinking about scarcity and competition for resources. And I think about emergent strategy as being so good at combating, providing different ways of thinking against that. But at the same time, I think about how our own how difficult it is to grapple with, and how paralyzing that can be, where we just feel like we are stuck in a system and there's no way that we can really do anything of any consequence. And it's easy to become really nihilistic there too. So I think about like small steps, individual choices, and also like the systems work, right? So the small steps, like maybe you impose for yourself a land tax that would be similar to a property tax that goes to a land trust that's held by indigenous folks. I think about the Saga Raya Land Trust in California. They're doing incredible work, and have just like great language that for me is just like, oh, right, that is so, like, just to read what you're saying, yes, that is okay. And like, is it transactional and is it a clean payment? Sure. but and am I like marching off like feeling really great about myself? Like no, but it's one small step toward, you know, and the more ways that we can think creatively without getting paralyzed are all good, right? But I mean, I think it's really valid work too, because within relief, for example, you know, we have really just tried to tend our attention toward our membership, and we've been holding these strategic planning sessions. We've held, oh gosh, like 9 or 10 so far. They're 2.5 hours. We're paying folks for their time. They're around thematic topics, and then there's some general ones. And it is such an incredible privilege and completely overwhelming to hear folks in our community be able to speak freely about their dreams and visions for what they want their lives to look like, their families' lives, and also our collective, and also the state and broadly humanity as it interacts with the world around us. There is so much, if I think about the work that farmers could do, and by farmers I mean whoever you are as a farmer, and there are many farmers within our relief community, if they didn't have to worry about seeking grant funding, or if they didn't have to worry about outside employment to support healthcare, or they didn't have to worry about their children never having a teacher who is a person of color in 12 years of public schooling, or if they didn't have to worry about being on a list of 70 infants to get childcare for the first 3 years, 3.5, 4 years of their lives, like it's incredible. So I do think about how those structural supports that preserve our dignity, that anybody can work on and everybody has input into, those are so important because they enable us to think about the specific, you know, if we could just cover the basics, then we can really do something interesting and meaningful, which is to look at those special gifts and think about how we can contribute them. But I mean, as young people, and I don't, Lindsay, it's funny, young. I don't think I'm young anymore. But yeah, I mean, I think about all the questions in my 20s, and part of the reason I ended up, people always ask me in my day job how I got to be a farm educator, and it's like I had to get really creative because I was never going to access farmland. So I was thinking about whose land can I farm on, and how can we shape this? You know, it is so powerful to be able to dream freely, and that's the kind of liberation that I want for the world. And so, what are those first steps that support everyone that we can work on? Those are big questions too. And who is afforded the privilege of a stable employment with good benefits to be able to participate in those sessions? You know, it's complex.
Thanks, Megan. That's a lot to think about, but yeah, definitely themes that have come up, I know, in my life a lot with my choices and friends, and you know, having those supports has been a big part of why people have sort of ended up in different places in their lives or not having those supports. And so yeah, it's heavy stuff, but I think you're right that if we have those basic supports, then we can do so much more. And also, I was thinking a little bit about what you said about productive conflict, and that comes up a lot in the workplace. And yeah, just how much people are afraid of having conflict, and you know, avoid having productive conversations when things don't go right. And so that's something that I think is also really important to think about, how best to do that and be open to that.
Ollie, I have one really concrete thing, and I know we're over our time, but one of the things I have always thought about in my employment, and also because I've like literally had to have folks replace me because I've had a couple kiddos and had the great privilege of having a parental leave twice. But I'm always thinking in any job that I'm in about who's going to replace me and how I can set them up to be successful. Because the world that I want to live in, I am not the radical like relief organizer or food and garden educator that I want to be. I'm somebody who's like way more versed in this than me. And so I'm not writing down a position manual for my job or my role because I want somebody to follow exactly what I'm doing, but I want them to be able to see the underlying assumptions and the ways that I was making choices so that when they're faced in that same position, knowing that I'm not going to like overturn massive institutions or an organization by myself overnight, but I want to poise the next person who's stepping into that role to be successful so that they can have a picture of what are the considerations, what are the parameters, how did I make a choice in the moment, how will I open them up space to hopefully make a different choice or approach something in a new way in the future. And for me, it's really cool to like actually imagine that person who's stepping in, who's going to replace me. Like, I can't wait. That makes me so excited, honestly. So like in work, documenting out everything, because I think about how much stepping into workplace environments in particular, how much we assume, how many standard operating procedures we just roll with because there's not time to investigate like, oh, why do we call it that? Why is that person not invited to the meeting? Or, or like, just because their Outlook calendar says they're busy, that means that we're not going to invite them to the meeting. Like, how did we make that choice? So like revisiting all those little things and writing that down so that your rad replacement who comes in at some point doesn't, probably not next year, but down the road or whatever, is really well poised, and they don't have to figure out the boring stuff so they can do the radical transformation work that's coming next that will suit the moment that they're in.
Definitely, that's so true. Succession is something people don't really think a lot about. And I've definitely been in that position as
It's so
the new
boring.
person. Yeah. But also, yeah, trying to leave your job and hoping that the next person isn't starting from before, like behind, they're starting ahead of where you started. So important. Well, looks like we're over time, and I want to give everyone a chance to have a break from Zoom for a little bit before our next session starts. But I'll just remind you guys that we're going to come back for reflections at 1 o'clock. And yeah, thank you guys for this great conversation. It was nice to meet all of you and spend a little time with you. And
Thanks
yeah,
so
have a
much.
great lunch break, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks,
Buddy.
Megan.
Bye,
Thanks,
thank
everybody.
you.
Thanks, Victoria.
Thanks for organizing.